All right. So this week, we begin to actually jump into some content that's not just learning about the words themselves per se, but actual systems of the body. So if you remember the CTOS that we talked about last week, cells, tissue, organs, and systems, we're going to slowly start working through those systems as we basically work through the rest of the book. And then in doing so, we'll find ourselves with a little bit of extra time in each class session to talk about healthcare in general. So we'll jump right into integumentary system, which basically just means the skin and its associated tissue. So here's the objectives, starting on page 92 of your text. And when we talk about the integumentary system, we're basically talking about obviously the skin, which we've mentioned, but also fingernails, toenails, hair, and then the glands that sort of are composed inside of the skin layers. So sweat glands, oil glands, and of course, hair follicles. Most of what the skin system does is protect us. It is obviously, it kind of contains and sort of seems like it kind of holds us in, but it's really a protective layer of our immune system. And it allows us to keep germs and dirt out of our body while also maintaining a normal balance of nutrients and moisture inside the body. So it is very crucial to our body. It's one of probably the most underrated or glorified systems that we have, but it's one of the most important systems that we have. However, if you look at the human body, it's what we call irreducibly complex, in that if you took any one part of it away, it simply can't survive. For example, if you took blood away from the human body, it doesn't matter how good your brain is, you're not going to survive. If you took your digestive system out of the human body, you're not going to survive. There's certain components of the digestive system and other systems that can be removed or replaced or modified, and we still can survive, but you can't take that whole system out and its function. There's just no way in order to be able to for a system like ours to survive in that fashion. So the skin is really important in that. From a sort of a infectious disease standpoint, everything we hear about right now with the coronavirus is basically all respiratory related, in that we're inhaling it or we're touching something, and then we are touching our mucous membranes, eyes, nose, mouth with it. And so those two systems are breaks in our skin, in our integumentary system, and they allow for germs, whether it's bacteria, virus, fungal, or whatever, in order to basically get past that wall that's up there to protect us. And of course, that's the easiest path into our body, is through those mucous membranes and into the respiratory system. And that's why we're often most vulnerable to those types of issues. Otherwise, our skin does an amazingly good job of protecting us. You could go and touch something that's covered with virus, bacteria, fungus, you name it, and it's not going to become an infectious part of your body unless you then take that and touch a mucous membrane or create an aerosol to inhale whatever it is that you're touching. The only other way is that if you've got some type of break in your integumentary system. And that's why we see cuts sometimes kill people. Sometimes people get a cut and then they get an infection in that cut. For example, you're doing something out in the yard, you cut yourself, it doesn't really bleed that bad, you keep working, and then pretty soon you get a fungal infection and it gets into your bloodstream through that break of your integumentary system, and then that would eventually end up killing you. So there are things that are like that, and we do see that in the hospital. It's not nearly as frequent as these other types of infections, but it does sort of impact how important our integumentary system actually is. So just a real quick overview of the biology or anatomy of the skin. And looking over here at the left-hand side, we have the, let me grab my pointer, the epidermis, which is those top layers. So that's what everyone sees as far as your skin is concerned. It does kind of have two layers, but it's all considered the epidermis. The cornified layer, or the keratin, is the very top layer that we all see. That's maybe you've heard, that's, you know, sort of like all your dead skin tissues that have been built up and slowly flake off throughout the day. That's basically what your keratin or your cornified layer is. And it's the outermost layer that covers up or is combined with the epidermis. And then below that, you've got the dermis. The dermis contains all your vasculature and most of the basal structures for your glands. And when I say basal, I mean like the bottom or the base of that. So you can see that, like, you've got your hair follicle is in the dermis. You've got your sudoriferous glands, or your sweat glands, as well as your sebaceous glands for your oil glands, all sort of starting or being based in the dermis layer. And then you can also see the arteries and the veins that are flowing through those. So you've got the red arteries and the blue veins, and they're intermingling amongst themselves in the capillary system. And then below that, you've got your subcutaneous or your fatty tissue section, which also is vascularized, meaning it's got the arteries and the venous system in it as well. But that's where you're starting to get the fat or that insulation layer, some of your energy stores in that layer. So if you were to cut your hand and, you know, let's say you slice it and you're only slicing through the epidermis layer, you're probably not going to bleed. It's probably not going to hurt a whole lot because you really don't have any nervous tissue in that layer. So our nerves is typically what's causing us, and pain receptors is what gives us pain, a sensation of pain. And if we're not, you know, if we're not causing them to be instigated or aggravated, then it's not going to hurt. So, you know, something like a little scratch on the skin or in the keratin layer, not going to bleed, really doesn't hurt. You might feel the pressure of the scratch through into your sensory, into your nervous system, but it's not going to be like a painful sensation. You're just going to feel that pressure. Now, if we cut deeper into the dermis layer and we're starting to cut down here, that's when we're going to start bleeding, because then we've actually cut into some of those capillaries, some of the tiny little arterioles or venules, and then also the nervous tissue. So that's where we're going to start to actually feel a little bit more pain and prolonged pain as a result of that. And these next few slides kind of just explain what I just talked about there. So I'm not going to spend you know, much time going over those items because we basically already have. Melanin, which we did not mention, that's of course what gives your skin its color. Most people have heard of that at some point. It's why, you know, the lack of it, some people are whiter than others, and the more of it that you have, that's why some people are darker than others, and anywhere in between. It's interesting though that when you look at the skin and the melanin, our genes actually have the ability, based off of the genetic information inside of you, and if you look back to ancestors, historically, they've got enough genetic information that it can lead you to be either lighter skinned or darker skinned based on how those genes are sort of turned on or turned off. And then as that goes down through familial generations, and you get, you know, if more light colored skin people mate with other light skin colored people, then you've got more of those genes turning on a lack of melanin. and therefore you become fair or lighter skinned. Whereas if you're going darker with, if you're mating with someone who's got darker skin, then through familial generations, it's going to result in more melanin in those offspring. We talked about the two different types of glands. Sudoriferous, kind of a hard word to say, but practice saying those things. I always like telling my students to practice saying these terms to their pets. If you have a pet around the house, just say sudoriferous to them and ask them about it. One, it helps you to sort of teach them what it's about. So it really isn't teaching them, but it's helping you to make sure you've got that wording in your mind laid out before maybe a human comes home and you try it out on them. But it also just helps you get those words out. So oftentimes, like at church, there's all these names that you can't pronounce when you read through the Bible, or they're saying them from the pulpit, and you're like, how do you even pronounce that name? And oftentimes, as long as you're just confident and you just say it like you know how to say it, no one's going to question you on it. They're just going to go with it, like, wow, you're really smart because you know how to say that word, right? So saying something like sudoriferous will take some time. I stumble over it if I don't say it frequently. But that, again, that just means sweat. And then sebaceous for oil. Hair and nails, of course, we've already talked about those. The combining forms of the integumentary system. So this chart is going to be really good for you guys to sort of devote to memory, because these are some of the frequent terms that are key to the integumentary system. So I do recommend, making these a flashcard or devoting these particular terms to memory. There's not that many of them in this section, although there are more coming up that we'll talk about that are also important and somewhat specific to the integumentary system, but these ones specifically. So anytime you see a word with derm or cutane or cute, it's basically going to mean something to do with the skin. So of course we say subcutaneous, right? Cutaneous tissue, or dermatologist, all of that having to do with the skin. So anytime you see that word root, you're going to be thinking something skin related. Hydro or hydro is sweat. So again, just something to kind of think about. When I do it, I try to think of water, hydro, even though it's spelled different. But it helps me if I think hydro, water, as it relates to the skin, is going to be sweat. And then carrot with the K, that's that corniculate section. That's that dead skin layer, if you will, that's at the end, or at the top of your epidermis. And then onych or onycho and ungu or unguo has to do with your fingernails or toenails. So and typically you're seeing that onych or onycho more than you will the ungo or unguo. So when you see that onycho, think something nails, something to do with the fingernail or the toenail. Seb just goes back to the sebaceous gland, so sebum, oil. And then tricho has to do with the hair, which is a little bit tricky because I didn't mean to do a word play on words there, but kind of did, tricho, because the hair, it really doesn't have any sort of relationship to that word in our English language. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to understand. Now remember, as we work through these, we're going to have those words that are built from word parts, and then we're going to have a bunch of words that are not built from word parts. If we go all the way back to chapter 1, remember that category 1, built from word parts, that we can actually break those down into their word parts, the word roots, prefix, suffix, and then the combining vowel to make the combining form. And that's how we can derive our meaning. But the rest of them, the eponyms, the acronyms, and then those built from like our English words, those we're just going to have to memorize from consistent and constant use. So some combining forms that are also used with the integumentary system. There's a lot here. It does become hard to memorize all of these if that's, sort of your learning style. My recommendation is, of course, to write them out. So just the fact that you make note cards is helping you because you're writing them out. And then going through the note cards is helpful, but not as helpful as writing information down. And then after you start becoming proficient in writing them down, then you can use note cards to just really quickly say them back and have them down. So some of the things that you'll see here are somewhat specific to the integumentary system, but mostly just sort of can be used with any of the systems, any of our medical languages. They just happen to also be used in the integumentary system on a frequent basis. So some words like crypt or crypto, that's just in the general sense meaning hidden. Bi or bio meaning life. Some that are specific to the integumentary system, such as the righted or rightido for wrinkles. So if you're in a dermatology office or a plastic surgeon's office, you're going to be using that righted or rightido terminology a lot. And so anytime you see that, you're going to be thinking, okay, something to do with the wrinkles, because it's a cosmetic surgery type of procedure that we're usually using that term. A term like strept or strepto, we'll talk about this a little bit later in this system. You see there, it means twisted chains, and that's kind of a weird definition for anything medical. Like, what does twisted chains have to do with it? But if you think back to like biology classes and things like that, the composition, or what we call the morphology, the shape of different types of organisms like streptococcus, it's how we describe the shape of or morphology of certain types of cell bundles and structures. Some common prefixes, most of these you've seen before, so it starts to become a little bit easier because we're starting to be getting some familiarity with, okay, like, yeah, I understand what this means. For example, epi, on, upon, or over, so epidermis, okay, it's on the dermis, it's on top of the dermis, or it's over the dermis. Intra, meaning within, as opposed to inter, okay, meaning like across. So keep that in mind. Para, meaning beside, beyond, around it. Per, meaning through, so such like percutaneous. So the us in percutaneous, meaning pertaining to. The cute, the cutaneo, meaning the skin layer or the integumentary system. And then the per, meaning through. So we're going through the skin layer when we say percutaneous. One example of that, a couple examples, if you stick a needle into someone, you're going percutaneous. Now, depending on where you stick that needle, you may actually just be going like just right in the epidermal layer, as opposed to into the dermis layer or the actual subcutaneous layer. So there are some aspects of subcutaneous and needle injections that are not always subcutaneous per se. Another good example of using the term per, like percutaneous, through the skin, when we do tracheostomies on patients, and basically that means we need to cut a hole in their neck, and then it goes into the trachea, which is just superficial or just below, shallow of the skin, in order to put a breathing tube in that patient. That is called percutaneous because we're doing that through the skin. It's a percutaneous tracheostomy, meaning, okay, ostomy, the procedure of putting a hole through the trach, meaning the trachea, and then it's percutaneous pertaining to the skin layer going through the skin layer. So that's where we would be, you kind of have that medical terminology where you have a percutaneous tracheostomy. You're combining or adding multiple medical words and terminology in order to further explain what's actually going on with your patients. And then trans, meaning across, through, or beyond. Some common suffixes, again, we've seen a lot of these before. Usually when we put an A at the end of a word, it's simply to make it easier to say. It doesn't really have a meaning, so keep that in mind. Here we see coccus, so we said streptococcus before, and here we see that suffix coccus as berry-shaped, again, speaking to the morphology of a certain type of bacteria. Ectomy, meaning the excision of or the surgical removal. So if I say the patient had a pneumonectomy, the ectomy tells you there's a surgical procedure to remove something, and the pneumo, P-N-E-U-M-O, pneumo, is telling us that part of the lung or a lung was removed. So it was a pneumonectomy because they removed a lung. Itis, we've talked about itis a lot as far as inflammation. It's probably the most common one we think about. Malacia, we don't hear commonly, but it just means softening, again, sort of keeping things around the respiratory system. Trachea, malacia, and so if we have softening of the trachea, the cartilage that builds the rigidity of the trachea, we would call that tracheomalacia. So we're adding a combining vowel to trachea to make it a combining form for tracheomalacia. That just means a softening. Sometimes when we have tubes in the trachea for too long, such as a endotracheal tube coming from the mouth, endotrachea, or if it's a tracheostomy tube, it will just sit there for so long, and the balloon that's in there to seal the trachea will start to cause the cartilage rings to soften and not be as rigid. So then if you pull that tube out at some point, the trachea has a tendency to collapse a little bit because it's now softened. It's not as rigid as it should be. Opsy, you guys have probably all heard of biopsies before. So we just learned about bio meaning life and opsy being viewing or viewing. So if we do a biopsy of, a certain clump of cells that we think might be a tumor, whether it's malignant or benign, we're doing that biopsy in order to take a look at it and to see exactly what those cells are. Phasia, we've used that before in terms of swallowing. So if we combine that with dys, D-Y-S, dysphagia, that means trouble swallowing. Rhea, flow or discharge. Plasty, surgical repair. A lot of times we'll hear this again from a dermatological or integumentary system type of application for rhinoplasty or rhinorrhea. Rhino meaning nose, plasty meaning surgical repair, or flow or discharge. So if someone has a bloody nose, you could say they have rhinorrhea. Now, it's accurate in that they have flow or discharge from the nose, but it's not accurate in describing the blood coming from the nose. We have another term for bloody nose, which we call epistaxis, which I'm not going to get into breaking that down at this point, but it's specific to a bloody nose. And then rhinorrhea would be more commonly just like a runny nose, a constantly runny nose that you can't get rid of. And then tomy, instrument used to cut, such like as we said, when you've got like a tracheostomy, tracheostomy, that's what we're looking at in that situation. So some words that apply to disease and disorder terms built from word parts. So just skip over to page 100. In your text, you'll see all of these listed out, as well as on the following pages, some really good exercises to work through these words and the definitions of these words. So I'm not going to spend too much time going through this, other than let's just kind of make some recognition here of what we're seeing with a lot of these words. Okay, so we see a lot of the derma, right? So meaning skin. And then we've got the onycho. Okay, that's another really familiar one. We might have derma down here, rhea and sebo. Okay, so like that sebaceous gland and that flow, we start to combine those things together. Phasia for the swallowing. And so again, there's some other common ones like the itis and the hydra. Okay, so you've got that sweating and inflammation. So inflammation of those glands. Leuco, remember we mentioned that before, leuco just meaning a white. It's the white color, so leukocytosis is like an increase of white blood cells, but in this case, leukoderma, we're seeing a whitening of the dermatitis, or of the, not titus, but the derma. So we've got a whitening of the skin layer. So you can start to see how some of these words are built and put together. And I do, of course, recommend you guys go through the exercises that are there on page 101 and let's see, 102. Those will be really good. Just a note about, you know, some of the terms where, for example, here you had para, but they just made it pero instead, where they actually dropped the a on it. It basically, in order to make it easier to say. So because the word to which it's added begins with a vowel, saying para o wouldn't be proper either. You could get away with saying, well, why do we need to use a combining vowel in this case? Because the prefix actually ends with a vowel. But in this case, remember, we're not actually using a combining form or a combining vowel. So let's break this up. You've got the para, and then you've got the onc, ia, pertaining to. So the O here, remember, this is not a combining vowel in order to make a combining form. The onic is part, the O is part of the onic. It's part of that word. And so because onic begins with a vowel, then we're not going to say paraonic. We're just going to say paronic, paronicia. So kind of just keep that in mind. Some of those types of things can be very difficult to understand when to apply them and when not to apply them. But remember to always try to find that word root first. In this case, it's the onic. And then once you find that onic, it's very easy to see, well, wait a minute, that O is not a combining vowel. Therefore, what's going on here? But don't let that weigh you down too much. Like I said, those are rare types of issues. And again, we talked about the suffix, the a, so like in pachyderma or xeroderma, has no meaning. It just, instead of saying xeroderm, the derm basically just allows us to understand that we're talking about a condition rather than just as like a singular. I don't want to say that it makes it plural, but it makes it understandable that we're talking about a condition or an unnatural state. So if we look at the kind of an analyze and define breakdown of one of these words, the onychomycosis, and we split it up into its word roots. We see that there actually are two word roots here. You've got the mic, and then you've got the onic. And so what we see is the osis, telling us there's an abnormal condition, and then the onic and the mic telling us that there's fungus of the nail. And so we said that before, anytime you see that onic, then you're thinking the nail system, and anytime we see mic, we're thinking fungus. So we're just combining those together in order to have an abnormal condition of fungus in the nail, which is actually fairly common, especially if you're not washing your hands regularly. So hand hygiene, not just in these times, but at all times, is important, especially for children, because what do they do with their hands? They put them in their mouth, right? But even adults, like how many people chew on their fingernails constantly? Like they just, you can look at their nails and you can see if they chew on them. And it's constantly just adding something to your system. You know, some people would say, oh, well, that's good for you. Eat a little bit of dirt and helps your immune system and helps you be resistant against, you know, certain things, because you're basically adding bacteria and viruses to your system in small components in order to build up resistance to them. And, you know, and there's some truth to that. There are some fungals and some fungus and some bacterial that just naturally occur, like in our soils, that can be deadly to us if, you know, if they do not get controlled by our body system. However, typically what we have to see is a immunodepleted or immunocompromised patient before that's actually happening to them. So, you know, you just being out working in your garden and having fungus and bacteria in that dirt isn't going to harm you in most cases. And then just the, of course, not breaking these, not analyzing these words down, but then just the quick definition of what each of these are. So some terms of the integumentary system not built from their word parts. And these ones, again, kind of in my opinion, are a little bit harder because it's just a matter of how often do you use these types of words. Now, someone, you know, abrasion, that's pretty easy. People use the word abrasion all the time, it seems like, especially if you're in the medical hospital or in the medical setting. But even the word abrasive, okay, if you're going to clean your stovetop, you're probably going to use some type of abrasive pad or a scouring pad or some type of, you know, soap that's got grit in it. If you're going to exfoliate your face, then you're using an abrasive type of compound in order to help you do that. So I think abrasion is something that is fairly well common. Medically, we're just basically, it kind of just means like a scrape. You know, you have an abrasion on your arm. Road rash, if your kid falls off their bike and they scrape up their, you know, their forearm on the concrete or on the blacktop. It's not like a laceration where it's a big old cut that's oozing blood out, but it's an abrasion, like it's scraped off that epidermis layer. You've got some blood coming out of it, but it's not an actual laceration or a straight cut into the patient's arm. Acne, of course, eczema, those are pretty common skin conditions that we see just in the public. We see commercials about them on TV all the time, so that's a little bit more normal for us to hear. Infection, of course, the last one on that list is something we hear all the time. Herpes, of course, most people think of the sexually transmitted disease when we talk about herpes, but there's all kinds of different herpes that patients can get that we'll talk about. It's just a virus, depending on what strain of that virus and where that's located determines on what type of herpes it is. Gangrene, don't really have this issue that much anymore. It used to be a major issue when we would have a bacterial infection, essentially cut off the blood flow to tissue, and then that would cause that tissue to die. And so you would say that it's gangrene. And again, yeah, I mean, you can't break that down and say, well, what do those words mean and how does that relate to what we're talking about? It doesn't. And because we don't see this issue anymore because we have antibiotics, as soon as someone gets a cut and it starts to become infected, it becomes red, erythemic, or starts to kind of be warm to the touch, or maybe the patient gets a fever. Okay, those are bad signs. Then they go to the hospital and they get an antibiotic, and that takes care of it. But 100 years ago, when antibiotics aren't regularly available, those patients, that could literally kill them. If you've ever watched sort of these survival movies, you know, like the Hunger Games and things like that, where they don't have the luxuries that we see, simply getting a cut can mean, the end of their life in that situation. What if they sprain their ankle and they're out in the wild? What if they happen to get a broken bone? Those types of things killed people, 100 and 200 years ago. And, it's just, medical care wasn't available to them. We live in a time where we take so many things for granted as far as our basic human survival needs, that we oftentimes don't think about what was medicine and medical care like, a couple centuries ago. And cellulitis, we hear that a lot in the hospital, talking about inflammation of cellular tissue. A lot of times when patients have IVs, they will have a cellulitis as a result of that, because the tissue gets inflamed, or if you're accidentally putting that IV fluid and it doesn't go into the vein, it's infused into the tissue, and now you've got a medication that's intended to be in the vein, but now it's in the tissue. It's almost toxic to it, and so it causes an inflammation. And sometimes an IV can be inside of the vein. And so the root for vein, we've seen vene, but also phleb, like phlebotomist, P-H-L-E-B. We could get phlebitis from having an IV catheter in our vein for too long, or constantly being poked at it. You can get sort of an angry vein that's all swollen up, and we call that phlebitis. You can see a few more of these listed there, like specific to integumentary system, like psoriasis, rosacea, the scleroderma, things like that, squamous cell carcinoma, skin cancer. All of these words fairly specific to the integumentary system. Some common infections, we've mentioned these just in passing already: the bacterial infections, fungal infections. I haven't really talked about parasites too much, but scabies is an example of a parasite. So where you actually have a living organism that is causing this issue. Viral infections, which we talked about, different types of herpes. And here we can see a couple, pictures of these integumentary problems. So, some bacterial infections on the skin, fungal infections. So the tinea, the most common with this one would be like athlete's foot. As you can see there, this drawing over, or this picture there, is in between the toes of a patient. And having athlete's foot back when I was in high school, pretty severely, both my brother and I had it, pretty bad. You're in sports and PE. I mean, we were taking like 3 showers a day, probably. Get up in the morning, you take a shower, you have gym class, you take a shower, then you have sports, something after school, and you take a shower. So it's not from a lack of cleanliness, but where are we showering? Right? We're showering in this communal shower in our school systems, and no one's going in there and and putting down or bleaching that floor between each classes of use. So you've got 6 or 7 different classes going through that shower every single day, and if you're just running through there with your bare feet, you're going to end up picking up something. And then, of course, being teenagers, do you always have a clean pair of socks with you? Do you always have a clean pair before, during, and then after gym? No. A lot of times they re-wear their own socks and their feet are just stank, nasty smelling. So it's kind of like no wonder that you get these fungal infections due to that. You've got these wet, moist socks that just sit around all day in a warm environment inside your shoe. Anyway, nasty. After graduating high school, I've never had a problem. No issue with it whatsoever. Go figure. And then the one on the left, we see pretty common too, ringworm. We'll see that in kids. Being a foster parent, in the foster system, a lot of times we see kids that will show up to our house after being removed with ringworm. in which case then you've got to get them on an antifungal. Oftentimes you'll treat it topically with the cream, and then also sometimes medically with an antifungal that they would ingest. But usually topical will take care of the problem fairly quickly. So it's not a major big issue, but it's just kind of a sign of neglect and uncleanliness in general of the sanitation of the places that those kids were coming from. Scabies was one of those parasitic infections that we talked about. And so there's a picture of the scabies mite there on the left under microscope. So you can actually kind of see what it looks like, kind of a gruesome little creature. And then what it actually looks like as an infection. You know, you look at this type of thing and you think about, wow, yeah, like I've seen people that kind of have hands that look like that on a regular basis. I wonder if they maybe had scabies. It's possible. And so then you kind of question all kinds of hygiene out in the public, and rightfully we should. You know, are there other things that could cause skin disorders that look similar to that? Yeah, there are. So don't, you know, I wouldn't say that you have to absolutely be like, no, get away from me, I don't want scabies, because it sounds worse than it actually is. But, you know, truth be told, if you just wash your hands on a regular basis, if you use gel on a regular basis, you're not going to have problems with this. But I mean, it's gross. These scabies mites, the females burrow under your skin and they lay their eggs, and then when they hatch, they like erupt, and you get these eruptions on your skin, and so that it's kind of nasty. So it should be looked at. You should definitely get it treated. Herpes zoster, you can see there below. So that's what shingles looks like. It's actually like a cousin of varicella or the chicken pox, right? So it doesn't look too much different than the chicken pox really, but it's basically an adult form of the chicken pox, if you will. But I've never had them, thankfully, but you've seen them plenty of times in the hospital. And a lot of older people get them for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure what the reason there is, but they itch, they're painful, like it's not comfortable whatsoever. And it is viral, so it's a little bit more difficult to treat as a result. Some surgical terms, and we talked a lot about, okay, if you're in a dermatologist's office, if you're in a plastic surgeon's office, you're going to be seeing a lot of these types of things. Some of them are very specific to the integumentary system and others are not. So if we look at the term biopsy, you know, we're going to see biopsies all over the place. Doesn't specifically mean skin, but it definitely can. We do lots of biopsies of the skin. If you've ever had if you've ever had a mole removed, it's basically a biopsy of that mole. You know, they're removing a portion of that tissue so that it can be examined and reviewed under the microscope. But other types of biopsies, for example, we can stick a scope down through the mouth into the trachea, into the lungs, and use these little pincher claws or needles to pull part of the skin or the pulmonary tissue out and then examine it. So if we see a nodule or a tumor, what we think is a tumor, some unknown mass down in the lungs, we're going to go down and biopsy, pulling that tissue out so that we can examine it. So, you know that some of those terms aren't specific to the integumentary system, but they're definitely used on the integumentary system. Now, when you get down to these other words where we're starting to see the derma, and so we've got the dermatoplasty, dermatoheteroplasty. So there we're starting to see where, okay, we've got the derma root and then the plasty for the surgical procedure. So remember, auto was basically pertaining to oneself, and then hetero. Think of heterogeneous or homogeneous. So heterogeneous would be meaning different. You know, you've got a bowl of M&Ms and they're all different colors. Okay, yes, they're all homogeneous in that they're all M&Ms, but as far as a color scape, they're heterogeneous because there's multiple different colors. So when you think heterogeny and homogeny, that's a good way to kind of understand it. Homogeny meaning all of the same, heterogeny meaning differences. And then of course, further down the onych for the nails, the righted, again with the wrinkles, sorry, I can't say these words either. Rightedectomy, there we go. And rightedoplasty, surgical repair of the wrinkles, or the excision, the ectomy of the wrinkles. Continuing on, cauterization, again, doesn't specifically relate to the integumentary system, although it's used with it. So we cauterize stuff all the time during surgical procedures. Cryo, again, not specific, but using extreme cold. So if you're freezing a wart off of the skin, that would be a cryosurgery type of procedure because you're freezing it using that extreme cold. And so that's fairly specific to the integumentary system. Debridement, debridement kind of has some baggage with it. If you look at the definition there, removal of contaminated or dead tissue and foreign matter from an open wound. And so if if let's say you're on your motorcycle and you hit a deer coming through the canyon on the way back from Helena, and you crash, and you've got these massive, not just abrasions, but these huge wounds in your skin, and those can be pretty shallow, or they can be extremely deep, where just huge chunks of flesh are missing. Well, while that flesh is healing, basically they have to go in then and debride it. They've got to go in and scrub it out to get rid of all of the dead and dying tissue that's in there, so that the fresh tissue and the new cells can thrive. And then if they do any type of skin grafting or tissue grafting, it has a clean, fresh bed in order to take up or make its home, and doesn't have the dead tissue that's in there. Sometimes there's rocks and dirt and trees and grass and stuff inside of wounds that they have to debride out of. Same thing with like burn patients, like severe burns, where like 95% of their body was burned, and what degree, 3rd degree burns, things like that. They actually have to go in and scrape that dead tissue off. So after the first couple days, that tissue layer, the stuff that's no longer vascularized starts to die, but it doesn't just like fall off. You actually have to go in and physically remove it, and that's called debridement. And it is extremely painful for patients. And so they're typically put on a large amount of pain medication or analgesia in order to help them with that. One thing that we often see with debridements in that type of situation would be like if you have patients who are meth addicts or heroin addicts that have used hardcore drugs for long periods of times, and then oftentimes they're cooking, and so maybe they're in an explosion, and so they get massively burned, or they just have really risky lifestyle behavior anyway, so they are in an automobile accident or whatever it happens to be, and so they have these really bad wounds or burns, and they have to be debrided. Well, they've built up such a tolerance because of their illicit drug use that we can't give them enough pain medication to soothe them during these procedures. And therefore we're cranking them full of tons of pain meds, yet they're just writhing in pain because it's not even touching them, because they've built up such a tolerance. So kind of a sad example of when we would use debridement. And I've got a picture and a few slides too that I can show you and talk about another example of that. So then we look at excision and incisions. You can see the differences between the two of those. You can also drain something. So if you've ever had an abscess where you've had to actually have the doctors cut it open and let it drain out, or maybe you've done that at home yourself. If you've ever had like a ingrown toenail or something like that, and you just like squeeze it and you squeeze that pus out of it. It's kind of like an IND or incision and drainage type of activity. Some complementary terms that are built from word parts. So I'm not going to go all through all these, and I apologize, they are a little small here, but things like dermatologist. Okay, so the person who studies the derma, dermatology, the branch of study. And then we get these other words like epidermal and urethrodermal. Again, ureth meaning the redness and derma meaning the skin. Hypodermic, like a hypodermic needle pertaining to under the skin. And so on and so forth. We've already talked about a lot of these already, like subcutaneous, streptococcus, necrosis, meaning tissue death, percutaneous. We've mentioned a lot of them already. So here's an example of streptococci. Again, not necessarily specific to the integumentary system, although it's applicable to the integumentary system. So round clusters. Staphylococcus, here's that twisted chains that we talked about.